Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today we're exploring a phenomenon that repeats itself throughout history, changing its target but never its tune. It starts with a whisper, then a shout. A menace is corrupting our youth and threatening the very fabric of society. This narrative, whether aimed at comic books, rock music, or video games, is the classic anatomy of a moral panic. It's a wave of widespread, often irrational fear that a specific group poses a threat to the community. But as we'll see, these panics often reveal more about our own anxieties than they do about the supposed dangers themselves. We'll dissect the blueprint of this societal fear, examine two of the most significant moral panics of the last century, and explore why we seem so eager to embrace them time and time again. The term moral panic was brought into the mainstream by sociologist Stanley Cohen in his 1972 book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. He defined it as a situation where a person or group becomes defined as a threat to societal values, and the reaction is wildly disproportionate to any actual harm they pose. Cohen outlined a 5-stage blueprint for how these panics unfold. First, there is concern. An event or group is identified as a threat. Second, hostility. This group is labeled a folk devil, a clear and simple enemy for society to rally against. Third, consensus. A widespread agreement builds, often fanned by media and politicians, that the threat is real and serious. Fourth is disproportionality. The level of fear and the solutions proposed are far more extreme than the actual threat warrants. Finally, volatility. The panic can erupt suddenly and fade just as quickly, often being replaced by a new concern. Fueling this fire are what Cohen called moral entrepreneurs. These are individuals or groups, politicians, media figures, community leaders, who take the lead in labeling a behavior as deviant. They often stand to gain authority, ratings, or political capital from the heightened public alarm. To see this blueprint in action, let's travel back to the mid-20th century and the first major moral panic centered on popular culture, the comic book scare. In post-war America, comic books exploded in popularity among young people, and just as quickly, a chorus of concerned parents, educators, and politicians rose to condemn them. They feared that the lurid tales of crime, horror, and superheroes were a direct pipeline to juvenile delinquency and moral rot. The chief moral entrepreneur of this panic was a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham. His 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, became the Bible for the anti-comics movement. Wertham claimed comic books were a primary cause of youth crime. His book was a masterclass in fear-mongering, filled with anecdotal evidence and misrepresented research. He made sensational claims that today sound almost absurd. He argued that the relationship between Batman and Robin was a homosexual fantasy, corrupting young boys, that Wonder Woman, with her strength and independence, was a corrupting lesbian influence on girls, and that crime comics were essentially how-to guides for would-be criminals. The media, hungry for a sensational story, amplified Wertham's claims to a national audience. Newspapers ran headlines about the comic book menace, and public book burnings were encouraged. The panic reached its peak with highly publicized Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, where Wertham was the star witness. The pressure on the industry became immense. Fearing direct government regulation, the comic book industry chose to regulate itself. They created the Comics Code Authority, or CCA, a draconian set of rules that sanitized comics for decades. The CCA banned any depiction of gore, sexuality, questioning of authority, or portrayals of corrupt officials. For a generation, it stifled the creative potential of the medium. The comic book scare is a perfect case study. A new media popular with youth was the target. Wertham was the moral entrepreneur. The media and politicians built a consensus. And the response, the Comics Code, was completely disproportionate to the unproven threat. In time, the panic faded, but the scar it left on the industry lasted for years. History, as they say, often rhymes. As the panic over comics subsided, a new digital demon emerged to take its place: the video game. For over 40 years, from the simple arcades of the 80s to the hyper-realistic worlds of today, video games have been a consistent target for moral panics. The anxieties have shifted over time. In the 1980s, the concern was over addiction and truancy at arcades. The tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons was famously accused of promoting Satanism, sparking a nationwide satanic panic. The 1990s brought fears of violence to the forefront. Games like Mortal Kombat and Doom, with their pixelated gore, were singled out. The 1999 Columbine High School shooting became a watershed moment as politicians and news outlets rushed to blame the tragedy on the shooter's fondness for violent video games, despite a lack of any credible evidence. This pattern has only continued. The Grand Theft Auto series is a perennial favorite of moral entrepreneurs for allowing players to engage in virtual crime. Debates over the addictive nature of games like World of Warcraft and Fortnite echo the arcade fears of the 80s. And almost every time a tragic act of youth violence occurs, video games are immediately thrust into the spotlight, serving as a convenient scapegoat that distracts from more complex and difficult conversations about mental health, social alienation, and access to weapons. The video game panic follows the same script as the comic book scare. A new, rapidly evolving media, primarily enjoyed by young men, becomes the focal point for society's anxieties about violence and social decay. Moral entrepreneurs amplify the fear, leading to a cycle of public outcry and calls for regulation, all while misunderstanding the medium itself. So why are we so susceptible to moral panics? The answer is a mix of psychology, media, and politics. On a basic level, panics tap into our deepest anxieties, especially those about the safety of children and the stability of society. They offer simple, black and white answers to complex problems, providing a clear enemy to blame. The media plays a critical role. The old newsroom adage, "If it bleeds, it leads," means that sensational, decontextualized stories about deviance and violence get disproportionate attention, fueling public fear. Panics also serve political interests. They can be a powerful tool for distracting the public from more pressing issues, or for rallying support around a common, easily demonized enemy. By positioning themselves as protectors of morality, politicians can enhance their authority. The consequences are real and damaging. Moral panics often stigmatize already marginalized groups, particularly young people, whose culture is dismissed as dangerous. This intense focus on a single scapegoat, whether it's a comic book or a video game, obscures the real, complex, underlying causes of social problems like violence. The comic scare led to decades of creative censorship. The ongoing panic around video games fosters a climate of misunderstanding and hostility. In both cases, the panics were less about the actual dangers of the media and more about a generational clash and a deep-seated fear of the new and unknown. Ultimately, the anatomy of a moral panic is a story about us. It's about our fears, our prejudices, and our willingness to accept simple answers to complex questions. By understanding the blueprint of these societal fevers, we can become more critical consumers of information, more thoughtful participants in public debate, and hopefully, more resistant to the siren song of the next moral panic, whatever form it may take.